The box arrived on a Tuesday in September, and I set it on the kitchen counter the way you set down something you are proud of, with the particular satisfaction of a woman whose idea has finally arrived in physical form. 47 small white boxes, each containing a DNA ancestry testing kit, each one representing a member of Calvary AME Church in Atlanta who had signed up for what I had been calling for 8 months the most ambitious project of my 20 years on the Heritage and Culture Committee. I stood in my kitchen and I looked at those boxes and I felt the specific joy of a woman whose vision is becoming real. I did not know that one of those boxes was going to unmake my life. My name is Beverly Jean Harmon Cole. I am 48 years old. I am a high school history teacher at a public school on the south side of Atlanta, and I have been teaching American history, with particular emphasis on African American history, the kind of history that does not always appear in the approved textbook, for 21 years. I believe, with the conviction of a woman who has watched what knowledge does to a young person who has been denied it, that knowing where you come from is not a luxury or an academic exercise. It is the foundation of knowing who you are. My grandmother Dorothy told me that before I could fully understand it, and my years in the classroom have proven it true in 100 different faces. I grew up at Calvary AME, which is to say I grew up knowing who I was. My family has been at Calvary for 3 generations. My grandmother Dorothy joined when she moved to Atlanta from rural Georgia in 1961. My mother Evelyn was baptized there at age 9, and I was baptized there at age 11 in the same baptismal pool, by the same deacon board that had baptized my mother. That continuity is not incidental to me. It is the architecture of my identity. I married Marcus Darnell Cole 23 years ago at Calvary AME on a Saturday afternoon in June, in a ceremony that took 2 years to plan and 45 minutes to perform, and that I have replayed in my memory more times than I can count in the years since. Marcus was 25, the same age I was, and he was the kind of man that a church community takes pride in. Solid, quiet, competent, committed to his faith in the practical way rather than the performative one. He ran his own HVAC business. He served on the facilities committee at Calvary. He showed up early and stayed late and fixed things without being asked. He had been part of Calvary for 6 years when we met, introduced by my mother, who had identified him as suitable before I had noticed him at all, and who was never wrong about people. We have 2 children, Imani Elise, who is 21, and in her senior year at Spelman College studying public policy with a focus that reflects both her grandmother's activism and her mother's belief in institutional accountability, and Darius Marcus, who is 17, and who has his father's quiet competence and his grandmother Dorothy's laugh, and who is currently deciding between engineering programs at 3 historically black universities, a decision he approaches with the same methodical care he applies to everything. Our life, on the first Tuesday in September, when those 47 white boxes arrived on my kitchen counter, was what I would have called, and did call regularly, in the specific gratitude of a woman who had seen enough of other people's difficulties to know what she had: a good life, a built life, 23 years of Calvary AME, and 2 children, and a business, and a teaching career, and a marriage that was not fireworks every day, but was steady and reliable and real in the specific way that things are real when they have survived ordinary life together. That is what I thought I had. Let me tell you about the DNA project, because it is the engine of this story, and it matters that you understand why I built it and what it meant to me before I tell you what it became. The project was my idea, proposed to the Heritage Committee in January of that year as the centerpiece of Calvary's 75th anniversary Founders' Day celebration in November. The concept was straightforward and, I believed, beautiful. Each participating member of the congregation would take an Ancestry DNA test, and the results would be compiled, with full consent and privacy protocols, into a congregation-wide heritage map showing the African, Caribbean, and American ancestral roots of our church community. We would present the map at the Founders' Day service alongside a video tribute tracing Calvary's history, connecting the story of our church to the broader story of the African American people who had built it and continued to sustain it. The committee approved it unanimously. Reverend Gloria Washington, a woman of 63 who had led Calvary for 9 years with the particular combination of pastoral depth and institutional clarity that large congregations require, said it was the most meaningful programmatic idea she had heard in her tenure. 47 members signed the consent forms and paid the kit costs. I ordered them in bulk, coordinated distribution, explained the process, and established that all results would be shared with me as the project coordinator for the purpose of building the congregation map, with participants retaining full control of their personal genetic data. Marcus signed up without my asking. He said, "I want to know where we come from." I remember that sentence. I have turned it over many times since. Because we were a couple building this project together in our home, Marcus had added me as a family member on his personal Ancestry DNA account, the way many couples do when they work on genealogy together, which meant I had direct access to his individual results alongside the congregational data. It was a small, practical decision made without consequence in mind. I have thought about that since. The specific providence of a small, practical decision. I boxed the kits by household, labeled each one, and set them on the kitchen counter with the satisfaction of a woman whose idea is becoming real. My family's 4 kits, mine, Marcus's, Imani's, and Darius's, sat on top of the stack. October. The kits had been returned to the lab. The waiting period was 6 to 8 weeks, which placed the results' arrival in late November, perfectly timed for the Founders' Day service on the 3rd Sunday of November. I was deep in the planning, coordinating with the video production team from the church's media ministry, corresponding with the Ancestry platform's customer service team about the congregational account I had established, and teaching full-time through a particularly demanding fall semester. Marcus was quieter than usual in October. I noticed it the way you notice the weather changing. Not a dramatic shift, just a gradual adjustment in the atmosphere of a house that you know as well as you know your own hands. He was present at dinner, present at church, present in all the ways that constitute a functioning marriage. But there was a slightly increased distance in him, a fraction more time spent in his home office after dinner, a slightly shorter engagement in conversation. I attributed it to a large commercial contract he had been bidding on for his HVAC business. A contract that had been in negotiation for several months and that represented the most significant business opportunity he had pursued. I told myself that was what it was. Let me slow down here and tell you about the month of October, because there were 2 things that happened that I filed correctly and retrieved too late. The first was a Sunday morning in the 2nd week of October, when I was setting up the heritage table in the church narthex before service. I always arrived early to manage the committee materials, and a young woman I did not immediately recognize helped me carry a display board in from the corridor. She was perhaps 24, 25, with warm brown skin and a natural puff and a quiet manner that I registered as simply polite. She said she was new to Calvary, had been attending for about 2 months. I thanked her for the help. I gave her a Founders' Day brochure. Her name, she told me, was Keely Washington. I thanked her again, and she went on into the sanctuary. The second thing was that same Sunday, after service, I saw Marcus speaking with Keely Washington in the fellowship hall. A brief conversation. The kind of brief post-service conversation that happens constantly in a congregation of our size. Nothing notable in duration or appearance. But when he came to stand with me at the heritage table, I saw that his expression had done the thing that I had learned to associate with the large commercial contract. That slight overcomposition, the specific management of a face that is working harder than it needs to. I thought, that bid must still be stressing him. I was not looking at what was directly in front of me because I had not been given any reason to look at it, and because 23 years of marriage had built in me a specific kind of trust that was also a specific kind of blindness. And because I was in the middle of the most ambitious project I had ever undertaken for the church community I love, and because the possibility that the quietness in my husband in October had anything to do with a young woman carrying display boards in a church. Narthex was a thought that my mind formed and immediately released, the way your hand releases a coal before the pain fully registers. I will not perform excessive self-reproach about this. I will simply tell you that the signs I am describing were small, and that the trust I had built them against was large, and that the specific arithmetic of small signs against large trust is how most women arrive at the discovery that changes everything. Not through willful blindness, but through the blinding that is the natural consequence of loving someone for a very long time. Lord, I am 48 years old, and I know how to study history. I know that the most significant events are almost always preceded by signals that were legible in retrospect and invisible in the present. I know this. I have taught it for 21 years. I am asking you now, in the quiet of this October evening, to give me eyes that see what is actually in front of me rather than what I have decided to see. I am asking you for truth, even if it costs me something to receive it, even if the cost is more than I think I can pay. The DNA results began arriving in the Ancestry DNA system in mid-November, earlier than the 6 to 8 week estimate, which was an early gift I received with the pure gratitude of a project coordinator watching a timeline exceed itself. I had set up the congregational account to capture aggregate heritage data for the map, the broad geographic and ethnic percentages that would populate our visualization, while participants retained their individual privacy settings. My own results came first. I sat at my kitchen desk on a Wednesday evening and opened them with Darius watching over my shoulder, both of us leaning toward the screen with the specific excitement of people about to learn something they cannot fully predict. 73% West African, Nigeria, Ghana, Cameroon, and Congo region. 14% African ancestry broadly across the Sahel region. 9% Scottish and Irish, the specific mathematics of American history that no longer surprises me but still lands with weight when it arrives with your own name attached. 4% Indigenous Americas. Darius said, "Mama, we're Nigerian and Scottish and we didn't even know." I told him, "Now we know." Marcus's results came 3 days later. Because he had added me as a family member on his personal Ancestry DNA account when we began the project together, I had direct access to his individual results page, the same way I had access to my own. I was at school when the system notification arrived on my phone, and I did not open it until I was home that evening, because I had disciplined myself to review results at the desk rather than on my phone so that I could work with the data properly. I opened Marcus's results page at 6:15 on a Friday evening. He had strong West African heritage, heavily Senegalese and Malian, with some Nigerian in common with my own results, which I found beautiful. I noted it for the map. And then, at the bottom of the Ancestry results page, I saw the section I had been expecting and looking forward to as one of the most emotionally resonant parts of the project. DNA matches. Close relatives who had also taken Ancestry DNA tests and whose DNA matched significantly enough to indicate a biological relationship. For most participants, this section showed spouses, cousins, known relatives. For Marcus, it showed exactly what I expected. Imani and Darius, both high-confidence matches in the immediate family category. My own name, linked through our children's shared DNA. And one more. A match labeled close family, likely first degree. The name attached to the match was Keely Washington. Predicted relationship, child or sibling. Shared DNA, 1,742 centimorgans. I sat very still at my kitchen desk for a long time. I am a history teacher. I have spent 21 years teaching my students to read primary sources carefully, to not impose their interpretation on a document before they have read it fully, to consider multiple explanations before drawing a conclusion, to distinguish between what a source says and what you wish it said. I applied every one of those disciplines to what I was looking at on the screen. 1,142 centimorgans. I knew enough about genetic genealogy from the Ancestry platform's educational resources to know what that number meant. It was not ambiguous. A parent-child relationship typically shares between 2,300 and 3,900 centimorgans, though variance at the lower end is documented and real. A half-sibling relationship shares between 1,260 and 2,650. At 1742, the number fell in the overlapping range where both relationships were genetically possible, parent-child at lower variance or half-sibling with one shared parent. The platform's algorithm, working with probabilities, had labeled it close family and left the precise relationship for biology and conversation to resolve. Keely Washington was 24 years old. Imani was 21. Darius was 17. I did the math that every woman in my position does. The math you do with your whole body rather than just your mind. Keely Washington had been born the year before Marcus and I were married. I closed the laptop. I opened it again. I closed it again. Then I called my older sister, Lorraine. Lorraine is 52, a registered nurse, and she is the person I have called first in every crisis of my adult life, because she combines genuine love with the specific refusal to let love become dishonesty. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I had seen. The centimorgan number, the predicted relationship, Keely's age, the timeline. I told her in the flat, precise language of someone who is holding herself together by describing rather than feeling. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Beverly, have you talked to Marcus?" I said no. She said, "Before you do anything else, before you talk to anyone else, before the church, before the children, you talk to Marcus. You look him in the face, and you put what you know in front of him, and you watch what he does." I said I understood. She said, "And Beverly, I'm coming over." She was at my house in 40 minutes. Marcus was still in his home office. Darius was at a friend's house. The house was quiet in the specific way that houses are quiet when something enormous is happening in them that they have not yet been asked to hold out loud. Lorraine sat with me at the kitchen table, and we drank tea, and she did not say anything except what needed to be said, which was, "You are not crazy, you are not wrong, and you are strong enough for whatever comes next." She said it 3 times at intervals because she knows me well enough to know that I need to hear something important more than once for it to penetrate the part of me that is still trying to find an alternative explanation. At 9:30, when I heard Marcus's office chair move and his footsteps in the hallway, I looked at Lorraine. She gave me one nod. I turned to face the kitchen doorway. I will not reconstruct the conversation in its full length because some things belong to the private space in which they happened. What I will tell you is the shape of it. I showed him the screen. I watched his face. He did not deny it. What I had not anticipated, what I think almost no woman anticipates in the moment of confronting a husband with evidence of this magnitude, was the specific quality of his response. Not explosive, not defensive. Not the scrambling of a man reaching for an explanation. Instead, a long silence, and then the particular exhale of a man who has been waiting for something he knew was coming and is almost relieved that the waiting is over. He said, "I have known about Keely for 4 months." I said, "Known what, exactly?" He said, "That she might be mine. She reached out to me in the summer. Her mother, Diane, told her before she died 2 years ago. Keely came to Calvary because she wanted to know. She wanted to see me. We have been talking." I said, "Diane." He said, "Yes. Diane Washington had been a member of Calvary briefly, a few years before our marriage, before she moved to Birmingham. I had not known her well. I had not needed to." I said, "When?" He said it was the year before our wedding, during our engagement. I looked at my husband of 23 years across our kitchen table, and I understood something that arrived not as a thought, but as a physical sensation. The specific feeling of a foundation that you believed was solid, revealing a crack that has been present since the building was first constructed. The crack does not negate the entire building, but it changes everything you thought you knew about what you have been standing on. I said, "You have been talking to your daughter for 4 months and you did not tell me." He said he was afraid. I said, "You were afraid, and I organized a church-wide DNA project with your name on it." He closed his eyes. I said, "Marcus, I need you to leave this house tonight, not permanently. I am not making permanent decisions at 9:30 on a Friday night, but I need you to leave, and I need to think, and I need to not be in this kitchen with you right now." He left. He called his brother. He did not argue about leaving, which was the only thing he did that night that I could find no fault with. Lorraine stayed until midnight. She slept in Imani's room, and I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling with the specific wakefulness of a woman whose mind has too much to process for sleep to be possible. And I thought about 23 years of a life I had been building on a foundation I had not known was compromised. And I thought about Keely Washington carrying a display board in the church narthex. And I thought about my grandmother Dorothy saying that knowing where you come from is the foundation of knowing who you are. And I thought that I had organized a heritage project with the intention of giving my congregation that foundation and had accidentally delivered it to myself in the most devastating possible form. God was not playing. He was simply answering the prayer I had prayed in October. Give me eyes that see what is actually in front of me. I had asked for truth. He had given it. Lord, I am in the middle of the night on the hardest day of my life, and I need to tell you something honest. I am angry. Not at you, or maybe at you, a little, in the way that a person is angry at the one they trust most when the thing they trusted most becomes the source of pain. I am angry at Marcus. I am angry at the years I did not know. I am angry at myself for not knowing. I am angry at Diane, who is dead and cannot receive my anger, which makes the anger heavier because it has nowhere to go. And underneath all of the anger, I am terrified. Terrified of what telling Imani and Darius looks like. Terrified of what telling the church looks like. Terrified of who I am on the other side of this. So I am asking you for the same thing I have always asked you for when I am most afraid. Stay close. I don't need explanation tonight. I need presence. Just stay close. The Founders' Day service was 2 weeks away. I want to tell you about those 2 weeks because they represent some of the most demanding interior work I have ever done in my life. The work of holding grief and responsibility simultaneously, of being a mother and a church leader and a wife in crisis all at the same time, and of making decisions about what to say and when and to whom, with the full knowledge that every decision had consequences that extended beyond me. On Saturday morning, Lorraine and I sat at my kitchen table again and made a list. Not a list of feelings, a list of decisions that needed to be made and in what order. First, Imani and Darius. Second, Reverend Washington. Third, the Founders' Day Project. Fourth, Keely. Fifth, the marriage. Marcus and the marriage were last on the list, not because they mattered least, but because the marriage was a long conversation that could not be rushed, and the other things required decisions that could not wait. I called Imani on Saturday afternoon. She was at Spelman. I told her I needed to talk to her about something significant and asked if she could come home the following weekend. She heard something in my voice that the phone could not contain and said she would come Friday evening. I told her she was loved and I would see her Friday. I went to Reverend Washington on Monday. I made an appointment through her assistant, which was not unusual. I coordinated with her office regularly for committee work. When I sat across from her desk, I told her everything in the same methodical way that I had been telling difficult truths all weekend. She received it with the pastoral gravity it deserved, and with the specific institutional awareness of a woman who understood that a church-wide DNA project revealing a congregation member's paternity situation required careful pastoral navigation. She said, "Beverly, I want to ask you one question, and I want you to answer it honestly. Do you want to pause the Founders' Day project?" I thought about that for a long moment. I said, "No. I do not want the project to become defined by this. The project belongs to 47 families and their heritage and their roots, and none of that changes because of what happened with Marcus and Keely. I want to complete the project. I want to present the heritage map. I want Founders' Day to be what it was always supposed to be." She looked at me for a long moment with the expression of a woman measuring something. She said, "Then we will complete it, and I will be right beside you." Imani came home Friday evening. Darius was in the kitchen when she arrived, which meant I had to make the same decision twice in 30 minutes. And I made it the same way both times, which was to sit my children down at the kitchen table where they had eaten 1,000 meals and tell them the truth in terms they could understand, without performing false composure and without letting my own grief overwhelm the space they needed to have their own responses. Imani cried. Then she stopped crying and asked questions with the focused precision of a woman who is processing systematically. Darius went very still and did not speak for several minutes, and then said, "Does she know about us?" Meaning Keely. And I told him yes, that Keely knew, and he nodded once and went to his room, and I gave him the space to do that because that is what he needed. Later that evening, Imani sat with me in the living room and said, "Mama, what are you going to do about Dad?" I said, "I don't know yet. I'm not making that decision tonight." She said, "What do you need from me right now?" I looked at my 21-year-old daughter, who had her father's quiet competence and my grandmother's steady eyes, and I said, "What you're already doing. Sitting here." She sat with me until midnight. I met Keely Washington for the first time in a deliberate way, not the accidental narthex meeting in October, but a real conversation, on a Tuesday evening in the second week of November, at a coffee shop equidistant from our two addresses, which was a choice I had made specifically so that neither of us had the territorial advantage. She was 24 years old, and up close she had Marcus's jaw and Marcus's way of holding very still when she was listening, a physical inheritance that I registered as factual information rather than allowing it to become something that inflamed. She was nervous in the way of a young person who has been waiting for something significant and is not sure how it will land. She had a cup of tea in front of her that she had not drunk. I had thought carefully about what I wanted to say to Keely, not what I wanted to feel, what I wanted to say. Because feelings and speech are not the same thing, and the difference between them, in moments of this magnitude, is everything. I said, "Keely, I want to be honest with you. I am hurt, and some of that hurt is complicated by the fact that you exist. Not by you personally, but by what your existence tells me about my marriage. I want you to know that I understand the difference between those two things, and I am committed to maintaining it. You did not choose the circumstances of your birth. You did not do anything to me, and the fact that you came looking for your father after losing your mother is not something I am able to be angry at. It is, in fact, something I respect." She looked at me with the expression of someone receiving more grace than they had prepared themselves to receive. She said, "I didn't want to destroy your family." I said, "I know. And I want to tell you something that I have been sitting with all week. A family built on a hidden truth is not the same thing as a family. What you did by coming here, by taking that DNA test, by being honest, you gave my family the chance to be real. That is a gift, even if it arrived wrapped in something terrible." She cried. I did not cry in that moment. My tears had had 2 weeks to do their work in private, and what was left in me by Tuesday was something steadier than grief. I handed her a napkin. I let her cry. We talked for 2 hours. She told me about her mother Diane, a woman who had carried a secret for 24 years and had told her daughter the truth only when she knew she was dying, because she could not leave Keely with a lie as the inheritance. I sat with the complexity of Diane, a woman I had never known, who had made a choice that caused harm, who had also spent 24 years carrying the weight of that choice alone, who had told her daughter the truth when it mattered. Human beings are not simple. Faith communities that pretend otherwise are lying about the nature of the people they serve. I told Keely about the Founders Day project, why I had built it, what it was intended to do, what it had accidentally revealed. I told her that her DNA was in the congregation's heritage map and that her West African ancestry was as real and as significant as anyone else's, and that the story of where she came from, the full story, including its complications, belonged to her. She said, "Will I be welcome at Calvary?" I said, "That is your decision to make, not mine. But I will tell you this, Reverend Washington knows. And Reverend Washington is a woman who believes that the church exists for the complicated and the wounded and the searching. You will not be turned away." She came to Founders Day, the 3rd Sunday in November. Calvary AME Church, Atlanta, Georgia. the 75th anniversary of a congregation that had been built by the hands and the faith and the sacrifice of African American men and women who had decided that this particular corner of this city needed a place where Black people could encounter God with dignity. The sanctuary was full. The choir was in their anniversary robes, white and gold, which the head of the choir had chosen specifically to echo the colors of the original choir robes that appeared in the founding photographs. The flowers were bronze and gold and deep green. The projection screen at the front showed the rotating heritage map, a beautiful, rich visualization of the congregation's combined ancestry, sweeping arcs of color connecting our congregation to Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Mali, Cameroon, Jamaica, Trinidad, the Carolinas, the Mississippi Delta. 47 families. Hundreds of years of history made visible. I stood at the podium for 20 minutes before the sermon, and I presented the project. I had written my remarks carefully over 3 weeks, revised them twice, and prayed over every sentence. I talked about my grandmother Dorothy, who had moved to Atlanta from rural Georgia in 1961 and who had walked through Calvary's doors because she needed a place where she could be known. I talked about what it means to know where you come from. I talked about heritage as a living thing, not a museum exhibit, but a daily inheritance, the specific way that the people who came before us show up in our hands and our laughter and our habits of prayer. I talked about what the DNA Project had revealed, not the personal revelation, but the communal one, that the people of Calvary AME were deeply, specifically, irreducibly African, that we were connected to a continent that was not a vague abstraction, but a collection of specific peoples and languages and histories that lived in our blood. That knowing that was not sentimental. It was structural. It was the kind of knowledge that holds a person up when everything else is unsteady. I looked out at the congregation as I said that last part, and I meant it in the specific and personal way that I could not say from the pulpit. The way that knowing your own foundation holds you when the building above it is fracturing. After the service, in the fellowship hall, Keely Washington stood by the heritage map display, and a woman from the congregation's genealogy team helped her trace her ancestral markers on the visualization. I watched from across the room. I watched Keely place her finger on the screen at the point where the data connected her to the Senegalese cluster, the same cluster that dominated Marcus's heritage profile. And I watched something happen in her face that I recognized as the specific expression of a person encountering proof that they belonged to something larger than their circumstances. Marcus was there. He had been at Founders Day because it would have been more conspicuous for him not to be, and because whatever was happening between us, I had not asked him to remove himself from the church community that was also his. He stood near the facilities committee table, in the specific solitude of a man who is managing the weight of consequences in public. He and Keely exchanged a brief, careful look across the fellowship hall. I saw it. I let it be what it was. I was not healed yet. I want to be very clear about that. I was not standing in that fellowship hall on Founders Day as a woman who had processed and resolved and arrived at peace. I was standing there as a woman who had decided that the thing she had built, the project, the service, the heritage map, the truth that 47 families now had about where they came from, was bigger than her pain, and that the pain could have its full time and space and weight in private while the public thing that needed to be done got done. That is not suppression. That is the particular discipline of a woman who knows the difference between her interior life and her institutional responsibilities and refuses to let either one erase the other. I want to tell you about the year that followed, because the story is not finished at Founders Day, and the truth I most need you to hear is in what comes next. Marcus and I spent 6 months in marriage counseling with a therapist named Dr. Renata Osei, a Black woman in her 50s who had been recommended by Reverend Washington and who had the particular gift of asking questions that made both people in the room confront their own interior landscape rather than focusing exclusively on the other person's failures. I went into that process with no predetermined outcome. I did not go into it committed to staying. I did not go into it committed to leaving. I went into it committed to the truth, which had been the commitment of my life since long before this season, and which this season had made more expensive than I ever anticipated. What came out of 6 months with Dr. O.C. was this. Marcus had made a choice during our engagement that was a betrayal, and he had spent 23 years of marriage building a good life alongside that buried betrayal. And the building had been real, and the betrayal had also been real, and both things were true simultaneously. He had told himself for 24 years that the choice to stay silent was protecting me and the marriage, when in fact it was protecting himself from the consequence of honesty. He came to understand that in Dr. Ose's office, and the understanding was genuine, and it was devastating to him, and watching him carry that devastation was one of the hardest things I have ever done. I also came to understand something about myself in those sessions that I had not expected to find. I had built, over 23 years, a marriage that was real, but that had operated on a kind of managed distance. Not cold, not unhappy, but with a certain amount of interior territory in each of us that we had never fully shared with each other. I had been, in some ways, a woman who kept her deepest self slightly at remove from her husband, because the deepest self had always felt safer in the prayer room and the classroom than in the intimacy of a marriage fully known. That pattern predated the betrayal. It was not caused by it. But the betrayal had broken the surface of it and made it visible, and seeing it was its own kind of reckoning. I tell you this not to suggest that Marcus's betrayal and my patterns were equivalent. They were not. But I am a history teacher, and I believe in honest accounting, and honest accounting required me to look at my own contribution to a marriage that was good but not fully known. After 6 months, Marcus and I made a decision together in the same kitchen where I had opened the laptop and seen Keely Washington's name. We decided to stay married. Not because leaving would have been wrong, and not because the betrayal was minimized or excused or forgotten. We decided to stay because 6 months of honest work had revealed a marriage underneath the wound that was worth building on. Not the old marriage, but a new one, constructed with the tools that the crisis had forced us to develop. We decided to stay because we had both done the work of seeing ourselves clearly and had chosen each other again, fully informed this time, which was more than we could say for our first choice 23 years ago. That decision was ours, and I offer it without prescription. Every woman in a situation like mine has to make the decision that is right for her specific life with her specific information. I am not telling you what to choose. I am telling you what I chose and why. Keely became, not immediately, not without difficulty, not without seasons of awkwardness and grief and renegotiation, a part of our family's extended reality. Imani met her first, at a coffee shop, on her own initiative, about 4 months after Founders' Day. Darius met her at a family gathering 8 months after that. The relationships were not warm and easy at the beginning. They were careful and tentative and specific, the way relationships are when they are being constructed by people who are honest about the complexity of what they are building. But they were real. And real, in my experience, is always the better foundation. Marcus formalized his relationship with Keely, acknowledged her publicly as his daughter, met with Reverend Washington to make a statement of accountability to the church's pastoral leadership, and began the specific work of being a father to a 24-year-old woman who had grown up without him, which is a different kind of parenting than the kind he had practiced with Imani and Darius, and which required him to learn new things about himself. I watched all of this with the complex eyes of a woman who is simultaneously the person most harmed by the situation and the person most invested in everyone within it, becoming their best selves. That is a difficult position to occupy. I occupied it imperfectly and with ongoing assistance from Dr. Ose and from Lorraine and from Reverend Washington and from the God who had answered my October prayer more thoroughly than I had requested. I want to tell you about what I built, because this story is not only about what was lost. In February of the year following Founders' Day, I proposed a new initiative to the Heritage Committee, a DNA-informed family reconciliation and healing program, partnering with a licensed counselor, that would be available to any church family navigating the kind of revelations that DNA ancestry testing increasingly surfaces in communities across the country. The unexpected paternity discovery, the unknown sibling, the family secret that a test result renders undeniable. These were no longer rare events in our congregations. They were becoming common enough that the church needed to be prepared to hold them with pastoral competence. Reverend Washington approved it immediately. She said, "Beverly, you are going to build something out of this that helps people for years." I knew that was coming. I was just waiting for you to see it. The program launched in April. I partnered with Dr. Renata Ose, who agreed to provide the clinical counseling component, and with a genealogist from the congregation who had expertise in genetic genealogy and could explain DNA results to families in accessible, non-alarming terms. I provided the pastoral facilitation, drawing on my experience with the Founders Day project and on the specific, hard-won knowledge of a woman who had navigated this territory personally. The first group of families we worked with included 3 situations, none involving members of Calvary for confidentiality reasons, where unexpected DNA results had fractured relationships that had not yet found a container for the fracture. I facilitated those sessions with the specific authority that comes from standing in someone else's experience and recognizing your own. Not because my story was the same as theirs, because I knew the specific loneliness of holding a DNA result in your hands and not yet knowing what it means for everything you thought was true. By the end of the first year, the program had served 11 families across 4 Atlanta area churches. Reverend Washington presented it at a regional AME conference in the fall, and I was invited to speak at 2 additional congregations about implementing similar programs in their own communities. I stood in front of rooms of Black church leaders and talked about DNA, heritage, family secrets, and the pastoral responsibility to prepare communities for the technological realities that are now arriving in our midst, whether we are prepared or not. I talked about the specific vulnerability of African American families, with our history of documented separation and undocumented connection, to the particular kind of discovery that genetic testing makes possible. I talked about what a church community can do to hold these discoveries with both honesty and grace. And I talked about my grandmother Dorothy, who told me that knowing where you come from is the foundation of knowing who you are. Because that truth had not become less true in the year I had lived. It had become more costly, more specific, more real. In the spring, about 16 months after Founders Day, I sat at a regional AME Women's Conference with Keely Washington beside me. We were presenting together. She, speaking from the experience of the person who discovers the unexpected match. I, speaking from the experience of the family that receives that discovery. It was the first time we had appeared together in a public context, and I want to tell you about the moment before we walked into the room, because it is the moment I most want you to carry. We were in the corridor outside the conference room. Keely was nervous in the way she always got nervous before something significant, that particular stillness, her hands very quiet in her lap. I was checking my notes, and she said, without looking at me, "Beverly, thank you for not making me disappear." I stopped checking my notes. She said, "After the DNA results, when you met me for coffee, you could have, I don't know, you could have asked me to go away. You had every right." I looked at her. This young woman, with her father's jaw and her own mother's eyes, and the specific grace of someone who has been shaped by loss without being defined by it. I said, "Keely, you carry my husband's blood and your mother's courage and the heritage of a people who crossed an ocean against their will and built something extraordinary on the other side. You are not something to be made to disappear. You are something to be reckoned with." She looked at me with her very still eyes. She said, "How do you do that? Just say true things like that." I said, 21 years in a classroom, you learn that the truth, told directly, is the most generous thing you can give a person." We walked into the room together. Today, I am 48 years old, and I know myself with a specificity that I did not possess 2 years ago. I know the particular shape of my own courage, where it lives in my body, how it feels when it is required, what it costs and what it builds. I know the specific texture of grief that has been fully felt rather than managed, and I know the difference between healing that is real and healing that is performed for an audience. I know that the truth I did not want to receive has built more than the comfort I thought I was protecting would ever have built. My marriage is different now. Not better in the superficial sense of more romantic or more peaceful. Better in the deeper sense of more honest, more known, more chosen. Marcus and I are two people who have looked directly at the worst thing and decided to build forward, and that decision, made with full information rather than optimistic ignorance, is the strongest foundation I have ever stood on. Imani called me last Sunday from Spelman, and in the course of our conversation she said, "Mama, I want you to know something. Watching you this past year, how you handled everything, that is the most important education I have ever received. That is what I want to be." I told her she already was. Darius has met Keely 4 times now. He approaches the relationship with the cautious precision of a young man who does not know exactly how to categorize something, but is committed to not categorizing it wrong. Last month he asked Keely to come to his school's Black History Month presentation because he had chosen family and heritage as his topic, and he said he thought she should be there. She came. She sat in the front row. He saw her from the stage and gave her the same brief nod that he gives his sister Imani when she attends something of his, the specific shorthand of a sibling acknowledging another sibling. I cried in the car afterward. The good kind of crying, the kind that is not grief but its opposite. And the Heritage Project, the 47 boxes, the congregation map, the Founders' Day presentation, is now a permanent annual offering of Calvary AME's Heritage and Culture Committee. This past November, for the church's 76th anniversary, we had 62 participants. The map has grown richer and more specific and more beautiful. The DNA-informed family healing program is in its 2nd year and has served 23 families. My grandmother Dorothy would be unsurprised by all of it. She had a way of accepting the specific ways that God answers prayers that I am still learning. She would say, "You asked for roots, and He gave you roots. Some of them run deeper than you expected. Some of them connect to trees you did not know were in your yard. But they are yours. They belong to you. Stand on them. I am standing on them. Every day, I am standing on them." A reflection for the woman, standing in the rubble of a truth she did not ask for. The DNA test did not break your family. The hidden thing broke your family. The test simply gave the break a name and a date and a number that made the pretending impossible. And as terrible as that naming was, it was also, and I say this knowing what it costs to say, a mercy. Because a family held together by managed silence is not the same thing as a family. And the God we serve is the God of truth, which means He is constantly, inconveniently, lovingly in the business of making the hidden things visible. Jeremiah 29:11 says, He knows the plans He has for us, plans for a future and a hope. That promise does not say the future will look the way we planned it. It says there will be a future, and there will be hope in it, and the one who designed it knows what He is doing. The truth that dismantled what you had is the same truth that is building what comes next. The two things are not in competition. They are sequential acts of the same divine hand. You are not the lie that was told about you or to you or inside your home. You are the woman who received the truth and chose to stand in it and build from it. That is your inheritance. That is your legacy. That is the thing your children are watching you choose. Stand on the roots. All of them. Even the ones you did not choose. They belong to you now. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever held a truth in your hands that you did not want and had to decide what to do with it, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment. Tell me what you built on the other side of the knowing. Tell me how you found your way back to solid ground. This community exists for the telling of true things, and your story matters. Like this video, if it held something you needed, share it with the woman who needs it more. Subscribe to Sister Circle Stories, because every week we come to this table and we tell the truth about what it means to be a Black woman of faith in all of its complexity and all of its glory and all of its specific, costly, irreplaceable beauty. We are here. We are not going anywhere. And neither are you.